happened with the link, but those who are part of this conversation today, thank you so much, and I would like to welcome you. Today, our presenter is Dr. Eric Makombe. He's going to give us his paper titled From a Roaring Lion to a Mewing Kitten, the Labor Movement in Post-Zimbabwe. Before Dr. Makombe takes over the stage, let me summarize Dr. Makombe's short bio to you. Dr. Makombe is a research fellow in the History Department here at University of Free State. He is also a senior lecturer in the Department of History, Heritage Knowledge System at the University of Zimbabwe. His broad research interests are in urban history, human economy, and livelihoods. The Dr. Makombe will take over for 30 minutes. Over to you, Doctor.
Well, thank you, Joylene. First, before I start, I'd like to thank, obviously, Joylene and her team. That's my brother Clement and Laszlo for setting this up. I truly appreciate it. So, as the title reads, I want to look at the labor movement in post-2000 Zimbabwe. I do this by engaging in a discussion of the factors that have stifled labor mobilization in the post-2000 period in Zimbabwe. So I think my entry really starts off in the introduction. I acknowledge that the centrality of the state in its various ways through its legislation, the use of violence and repression have been central to stifling the labor movement in this country. However, in this particular paper, I want to foreground other factors that would help us in painting a more nuanced view of how labor has fared in this country. So generally, or broadly speaking, the few workers that are still in employment, as we know, there has been deindustrialization and a lot of retrenchment, that accelerated in the 1990s with the adoption of ESAP and so forth. So the few workers that are still in employment are exposed to very crude forms of exploitation and abuse by employers, and they often suffer from wage theft, among other abuses such as the erosion of pensions, medical benefits, more so with the hyperinflationary environment that existed prior to dollarization in 2009. So, however, what we see here is a very large incongruence between the wages and the cost of living. However, the confrontations or the expressions of the labor movement against these injustices and exploitation are surprisingly fewer. Yet you would think that, judging by the recent history of the 1990s, these would have increased. But alas, this is not the case. So this presents somewhat a paradox. So this paper is an engagement with those with that kind of paradox, and to try and assess some of the reasons that could be proffered to account for this contradiction. So I start off following the introduction with a brief historical background that I'll quickly run through. So at the time of independence, there were several disparate unions that were weak and peripheral to the to the political economy of the country. However, the rank and file, in industry and in other sectors, immediately took the opportunity presented by independence to clamor for better wages and better working conditions. So they engage in a series of wildcat strikes, but the state immediately seizes on those strikes to put them down violently. with repression, and this would become the norm moving forward. However, the trend that was then set in motion is similar to other case studies on the African continent, such as Tanzania, which I cite as a footnote in the paper, where the state tries to co-opt the labor movement into its ranks because it was unwilling to encourage oppositional voices, more so as it was moving towards creating a one-party state. So in the 1980s, we have a general picture of state paternalism and corporatism combining to undermine the structures of worker representation. Union officials, their main role in this state paternalism, once they are co-opted, was to maintain peaceful cooperation between the state, capital, and labor. However, the honeymoon is short-lived, and starting in 1987, labor starts to assert its independence, and I think perhaps in the 1993 decision or declaration by Mugabe that is no longer going to be attending May Day celebrations marks this divorce altogether. However, even before that, well, with the introduction of ESAP, that is the Economic Structural Adjustment Program, and the beginning of trade liberalization and the deregulation of labor laws, you see that already some of the safeguards that were guaranteed in the 1985 Labor Relations Act are already being rolled back. And it's becoming easier for employers to fire workers and so forth. However, as liberalization unravels, there is a growing crisis in the middle class and the working class in general, broadly, which then manifests in increasing strikes starting in the mid-1990s, moving forward. In demonstrations by professional groups that included teachers, nurses, and doctors. I think that is captured in the paper to those who had the chance to go over it. So by the end of the 1990s, labor had backed itself into a corner, such that it felt, rightly or wrongly, that the only way it could, gain any concession against the demands of the working class was to capture state power. So the thisCTU underwrites as the main force. Of course, there are other forces that also join this broad-based movement, but the thisCTU is the main force behind the formation of the movement for democratic change. And some of the main leaders within the labor body, transfer into and then become political leaders in this new political party. So it is at this juncture that I identify three challenges that emerge as soon as at the turn of the millennium, arising out of this scenario that I've just painted as the historical background. And the first is the demise of the thisCTU in giving birth to the MDC, because whilst the MDC does very well in in the parliamentary polls of 2000, it actually gains 56 out of the 120 seats that are contested. However, ZANU-PF wins the remainder, which is 64, and it actually gains just a marginal majority in parliament, such that it holds on to power by the skin of its teeth. But however, once it recuperates from this, there's a massive backlash, mostly targeted at the thisCTU, such that it is not able to express itself, fully as it had done in the late 1990s as before. So there are successive electoral defeats starting in 2000, then followed by the 2002 presidential election, which disillusions many workers who felt betrayed by the outcome of what was happening at this time. And secondly, the fact that many leaders, I list them, that include not just Tsvangirai or Gibson Sibanda, but Nicholas Mzengerere, Gift Chimanikire, Tokozani Kupe, Lucia Mativenga, and others. These were veteran unionists, such that, and they had been in leadership for a very long time, such that their movement into the MDC weakens the thisCTU as the new leadership lacks experience, and furthermore, they are beholden to whatever is coming out of the MDC. So there is a general perception that is obviously hammered in by the ruling party as well, that there is an institutional closeness, there is an indivisible closeness between these two entities, the MDC and the thisCTU, and further the discourse around them being, these two bodies being Western stooges, is then propagated as well. So all of these work against the thisCTU. And we see that, in its attempts to even call for a peaceful, stay away, it is generally unsuccessful, arising out of this sense of disillusionment that comes out of the political realities as they are playing out. Then thirdly, the RBZ, tries to choke out, foreign funding that was coming in from the European Union, the Washington Consensus, through to the thisCTU, such that this body, the labor body, becomes bankrupt early on. So that is another challenge that it faced as the backlash by the ruling party, is intensified. Then factionalism also rears its ugly head, and this factionalism even mirrors the factionalism within the MDC. You have the Love Momatombo and Nkiwane factions that come out of the disputed electoral outcomes of the 2011 Congress. So this again hurts the thisCTU. So then lastly, the thisCTU also loses members, mainly from GAPUZ, the Agricultural and Plantation Workers Union of Zimbabwe, who some of the members feel that a rival union that is sponsored by ZANU-PF, that is the ZFTU, is achieving greater traction as far as worker conditions are concerned. So it loses membership to the ZFTU at this time. Then a second challenge, a second broad challenge that I identify in this paper has to do with the capture or the hijacking of the labor movement through within the MDC by middle class elements, the intelligentsia, who had formed part and parcel of this broad-based movement. Some of the leaders who, including Tsvangirai and others, actually lose the parliamentary polls in such that they are relegated. They appoint different leaders in parliament, such that the labor voice within the MDC is already muffled. But you see that in as far as trying to reconcile the competing interests within the MDC, it's now made up of a very curious mixture of capitalists, of white farmers, these middle class elements that I've spoken of. So it tries to walk a fine line, in trying to, cater for all of these competing, interests, such that it further disillusions the general rank and file towards supporting the thisCTU. And this is precisely why the thisCTU itself adopts stairways to try and accommodate such that they do not hurt the interests of capital by engaging in more destructive strikes and other forms of militancy, which they had done in the 1990s. So they adopt this very innocuous form of worker, essentially choosing the path of least resistance against capital. So again, because of this institutional closeness, the thisCTU is unable to articulate any, sustained agenda or policy around the land reform exercise that is taking place at the time. So it tends to vacillate in as much as the MDC itself is vacillating because of this curious mixture of interests that are now, have now taken over or captured the labor movement. However, having said this, looked at the neoliberal capture and the challenges that the thisCTU faced following the electoral defeat of the MDC in 2000 and the subsequent elections thereafter. I note that the greatest challenge that unions faced in the post-2000 period have to do with the massive structural change in the economy that has been documented and we are well aware of. However, I think in this paper I note that beyond the quantitative decimation of the labor force, through immigration, through the informalization of the economy, deindustrialization, depoliticization, and so forth, all of these processes taking place as the structure of the economy is undergoing severe changes. There are specific qualitative changes that occur at this time. For example, you see there's a greater casualization of labor, such that people are being engaged by the new employers on very short-term contracts, either in other forms of precarious employment. There's apprentices. There's an echo. Okay, let me continue. And also there is the demographic change, in that there is a greater proportion of the workforce is now younger, because why? Simply there's been an exodus of the more experienced staff to the diaspora, South Africa, Europe, and in other places, Australia and so forth, that I detail in the paper. And this new demographic generally averse to joining in the activities of trade unions, and this further decreases the trade union density at this time. And another significant qualitative change that occurs in the post-2000 period has to do with the nature of the employer. The first has to do with the greater investment from China through what was known as the Look East policies and so forth. And the Chinese employers are generally have an anti-union, a very strong anti-union stance that they take. And any attempt by workers to express themselves against working conditions and so forth are met summarily by firing and hiring other workers to take to fill in their jobs. And they have the general protection of the state, because the state is is under sanctions, is bankrupt. So any investor is welcome, regardless of the abuses that they mete out against the Zimbabwean workers. So some of the abuses that the Chinese are accused of include the child labor, physical abuse of workers, and even extending to sodomy of workers. I think I gave a case that was captured in the press in the paper. Then some of the other workers, some of the other employers simply arise out of the informalization, the increased informalization of the economy. And these are essentially higher family labor, and some of them are still, struggling resettled farmers, so they employ very few laborers, but they are again not in a position to accommodate labor. They're generally uncomfortable with their workers joining labor unions. So again, they suffer. The trade unions suffer as a consequence of these qualitative changes that are occurring at this particular point in time. So we see union membership being halved between 2001 and 2017. By 2012, wage labor only accounted for 12% of the economically active population. So this is where the chickens come home to roost, because traditionally the thisCTU and the labor movement had, recruited or mobilized workers in the formal, who were formally employed, and leaving out those who were in the informal sector. So without the formal base, they lost a significant base for which to carry on their activities. So I think in a nutshell that is my paper. I think for now, allow me to read from a portion of my conclusion. Then I'm sure I'll hand over to Joylene to take it up. So while the paper highlighted the acquired challenges that the labor movement went through under the political economy of disorder, it also explored the organizational, ideological, institutional, and structural weaknesses inherent within the labor movement. Many of the weaknesses had historical antecedents. Okay, somebody needs to mute themselves. Many of the weaknesses had inherent antecedents such that in the 1980s, thisCTU leaders developed into a labor bureaucracy, which, while purportedly acting on behalf of their constituents, they oftentimes went against the wishes of the rank and file members, as they were beholden to the government. Even though the post-1987 leadership significantly decided to cut ties with the ruling party, it still failed to create enough institutional capacity outside its top leaders for the Labour Centre to survive the structural changes experienced in the post-2000 years. The decision by thisCTU to underwrite the birth of a political party mortally wounded it. The umbrella body, apart from losing able leaders, became entangled with neoliberal middle-class interests who were also part of the MDC. As such, the new labor movement failed to come up with an emancipatory project outside neoliberalism. In fact, it wanted to accommodate, have a more benevolent form of liberalism, which was a very far cry from its stance in the early 1990s. So this demoralized the workers, who, under a sense of disillusion, opted to migrate to other countries, among other options, further weakening the organizational base of the labor union. Thank you. I'll stop there. Over to you, Joylene.
Thank you so much, Eric, for such an insightful presentation about the labor movement in Zimbabwe in the post-2000. Colleagues, I'll take this opportunity to introduce you to our discussant of the day, Dr. Clemente Masakure. Before he takes over the stage, let me give you a short bio of him. Dr. Clemente Masakure is a senior lecturer and head of department at the University of Free State. He is also the co-editor of the Journal of the Historical Association of South Africa, popularly known as Historia. Dr. Masakure has published on the history of Zimbabwe, including his recent monograph entitled African Nurses and Everyday Work in the 28th Century, which was published by Manchester University Press. Over to you, Dr. Masakure.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fanduri, and thank you very much, Eric, for this paper. I really enjoyed going through the paper. It's more or less like I was in class doing labor history in our master's course at University of Zimbabwe. I usually given 10 minutes, but I'm not going to take more than 10 minutes because I also like other people to chip in and also contribute. I would say this is, as I say, like a very engaging paper. Chronologically flows very well. One can actually map the continuities and changes in terms of labor history in Zimbabwe. I think your historical background does a fine job in terms of introducing even to non-Zimbabweans the history of the labor movement in Zimbabwe, starting with the post-independence period and efforts by the new ZANU-PF government to try and co-opt the labor movement. And also I think you did well in terms of discussing the cooperative strategy, which saw the state trying to take control of the labor movement. And in this process, we actually do have, you're absolutely right, you do have weak trade unions in Zimbabwe. And then you highlighted the key turning point, which is 1987, which also very much is a key turning point in politics if you want to think of the union between ZANU and ZAPU. I know no one has ever tried to make this connection, but it's something which I just thought of right now. And especially with the key turning point, especially the coming in of the new leadership, that I'll say does not have so much close links with the ruling party. They're still part and parcel of the ruling party if you think of Morgan Tsvangirai being a member of ZANU-PF, but it's a bit different from the old guards, your Albert Mugabe or your Makwarimba, who have been at least partly in the trenches with, not exactly the trenches with liberation movements, but they had close connections with liberation movements. And then there is a move towards autonomy of the labor movement, and at this time the labor movement becomes more critical of the state. And you see this, and especially what you've actually highlighted, this alliance between the labor movement and university students. I think it's extremely important, to really highlight this alliance, which we are going to see later on, an alliance between labor movements and other groups that will be fighting for democracy in the within the next 10 years. And of course, the 90s, in terms of trade unionism, that's when you begin to see, when it comes to workers and trade unionism, the impact of the economic structural adjustment program. And this, as you've actually highlighted, led to, amongst other things, numerous strikes, of which I think, if I'm not mistaken, the one of the most significant is the 1996 strike by civil servants. And when all civil servants had gone back to work, nurses continued striking until December. So it's more or less like you had various phases of strikes that starts in August. And for those in the health profession, the end in August with the dismissal of quite a number of nurses, and some of them actually we begin to see some of the first waves of diaspora of people leaving Zimbabwe going into the diaspora. But of course, this led, the impact of economic structure adjustment, which you've rightly posted out, led to the formation of the MDC, Movement for Democratic Change, of which the thisCTU is extremely central in terms of it provided some of the key leadership, which, if you have rightly pointed out, in the post-2000 era, it leads to the weakening of the thisCTU. And I think almost for many people, when they think of the thisCTU, even in the post-2000 era, they still think of Tsvangirai, even though he was now the leader of the opposition in Zimbabwe. And I'm really glad you highlighted, you identified at least these three, what you call disasters, which had significant implications on how the labor responds to the challenges in the post-2000 era. The challenges that include having a close link with an opposition party, which you actually highlight as a key disaster. I think in part this is because the Chiluba moment never arrived. And what I mean by that is the opposition party backed by labor movement never took power. And with the failure to take over state control, and with a very smart, I must put it, ruling party that devised new strategies in terms of dealing with not just the opposition, but in extension, the labor movement, you actually begin to see the weakening of the labor movement starting in the post-2000 era. And of course, you mentioned the issue of the middle class. And again, this alliance between the labor movement and other actors. You see that in '89, it's with university students, and then in the post-1987 period, it's with either people within the NGOs. With you have quite a number of lawyers coming in, and again, as you've actually correctly, this further weakens the labor movement. And of course, the biggest issue, it has to do with the changing economy. The land reform program and its effect on Zimbabwean economy, this has been well documented. And then especially if you want to think the deindustrialization and the informalization of the economy. Of course, with deindustrialization and informalization, the labor movement no longer has a very strong base to rely upon it. I really enjoyed reading this, and thank you very much. But I have a very few issues that I think you might want to think of when you are further working on this paper. The first actually has to do with the title, because when I saw the title, it says the labor movement. Initially, I used just to think of the labor movement being thisCTU, right? But as we know, the labor movement goes beyond thisCTU. You do well in your introduction to be very clear in your introduction that it's thisCTU, but I think this must also be highlighted in your in the title, that you're actually going to be looking at the thisCTU, so that it does not give any impression that I'm going to read so much about the ZFTU, Zimbabwe Federations of Trade Unions, for instance. Second, I think that is still related to the title, and I want you to think a bit more about this. Was it ever a lion? I know this is coming from a labor activist, Munyara Zigwisai, who is socialist, who has his own axe to grind with the MDC, and the way the thisCTU has actually been in bed with neoliberalism. So he, for me, he gives this impression of between 87 and 2002. It might be one of high points of labor movement, but was it a lion or it was just a normal cat? Let me put it that way. I think you might just want to make to think more about it and to make a critique, because this is coming from someone who has his own agenda, trying to, to show that, look, when I actually left the MDC, I think he must have left the MDC in 2002 or 2003, but I know it was way before 2005 elections. Now, look what happened to the labor movement when we, the socialists, left. The labor movement has now been weakened. It's now, if you want to think of it, a kitten. So I think you need to make a critique of it, whether he is exaggerating or not. In your so that's the second issue. The third issue is in your abstract, you kind of like mentioned the shop floor dynamics, and when I'm thinking of shop floor dynamics, here I'm actually just thinking as workers at, for instance, at a mine, as workers in a hospital, and this is at a very local level where we actually do elect our own representatives as workers. And we discuss amongst ourselves some of the implications of, for instance, policy and etc. Yet, I'm not getting that. So far, for me, it's still very much a broad national kind of look at labor movement, and does not. I'm not getting the shop floor itself. I don't know whether where you're going to get this information, because sometimes it's very difficult to get access to what exactly was happening in terms of unionism at the shop floor level. That is, if actually they do keep records, but it's something that you might actually want to think of. And closely related to that, it has to do, I think, you have mentioned the General Agriculture and Plantation Union. My question was, how exactly did they respond to the MDC being funded by their employers? And I think, again, this kind of information, you can get it if you go a bit deeper into this shop floor politics. Then the fourth, I'm almost done, Eric. The fourth, it has to do with factionalism and the split of 2012, if I'm not mistaken. What exactly was the driving force? You just mentioned that, like you have this split. Is it ideological? Do they actually do have an ideology? That's the other thing. Or these are just opportunists or just taking advantage of possibility of a vacuum and say, I want to be, to lead this faction, or to be the leader of the thisCTU. Last but not the least, it has to do, why has the thisCTU failed to penetrate and mobilize outside of the formal structures? The possibility of Zimbabwe, at least in the next 10, 15 years, reindustrializing and the labor union getting its best back again, it's very limited, at least from what we are seeing. The other way might be for the labor movement to mobilize outside of the normal structures. So what have been the hindrance in terms of trying to mobilize beyond those structures? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clement, for your contribution. You have raised a lot of insightful questions. I think, Eric, can you respond to Dr. Masakure before we open the platform to our audience?
Well, thank you so much for those yeah, indeed, insightful comments. Yeah, there's a lot here. I will see which ones I can pick and choose. Thank you so much. I think you raised the possibility of tying these developments, the 87, breakaway with developments around the Unity Accord. I think that is something that I can definitely look into. And for the record, I think I will be quoting you on this Chiluba moment. I think that's a very insightful and sharp remark there, that it never arrived. So that is something that I'll take as a contribution. Okay, then let me maybe go straight to the concerns that you raised around the title. Again, I'll take that on board, that here the focus was on the thisCTU. So it's something that I will take on board. Then a critique of Gwisai's catchphrase. There's always a danger in reducing historical developments to these. But I think the point really was to provoke the debate around the state of the labor, of the thisCTU in this case, not necessarily the labor movement. And I do take on board what you said, that Gwisai is in fact the wounded lion in this case, because he's just been fired when he's writing this in 2002. So he wants to present a picture that, before, when he was part and parcel of the militancy that was occurring in the mid-1990s, the thisCTU was strong. But if anything, I think the paper actually proves that there were organizational weaknesses and institutional weaknesses that had historical antecedents dating back to the pre-1980 years. So indeed, I think it is an overstatement to call it a lion. There were very inherent weaknesses within the thisCTU that were simply papered over by the favor or the fermentation of unrest that occurs in the 1990s. And these are actually what came out once the leadership that had been papering over these weaknesses move on to the MDC. So indeed, it is very problematic. So I'll see what I can do with that title. The shop floor dynamics, you're exactly right. I had to cull the paper significantly because I saw that, for a seminar paper, it was getting out of, it was getting a bit too long. So I have quite some information around this shop floor dynamics. I've interviewed a few people. I think I've quoted only a few in that in the paper before you. So those shop floor dynamics, we have to remove them and develop a separate paper. But the idea was really to show that what is happening at the national level is also being replicated at shop floor level. So, for example, the formation of rival unions is also being actively promoted by human resource departments in the various sectors. For example, in the tourism sector, you have a rival union that is encouraged by the ruling party to challenge the more established union. So you have a kind of a mirroring of what is happening nationally at the shop floor level. So, but however, I do not deal with these issues sufficiently. I had to cull those out of the paper because of issues of space. I like the point that you raised about Kapos. How did it, react once, the MDC incorporates its former, employers who have been kicked off the land. So that is something that I think I can take up. The split, I think, it is personal. These are simply, unfortunately, that is what characterizes politics or such issues in this country. So they are simply personal differences that arise out of a disputed electoral outcome from the 2011 Congress. So you have Kiwane, who is backing Trangirai, and Love Momatombo, who is backing Welshman Ngube. So it is simply the factional fights that are occurring in the broader MDC at the national level being transposed onto the dynamics of the thisCTU. So why has the thisCTU, I think that's the last point, failed to mobilize outside formal structures? I think it was initially an ideological, straitjacket that it found itself in. However, I think the new leadership under Mutasa, Peter Mutasa, is making some significant headway, towards incorporating these, the informal elements, be they vendors and so forth, by actually engaging them. But it's something that, the older leadership, you find that the new leadership around Mutasa is younger. So perhaps that could have a bearing, but it's something that I'll probably need to engage with a bit more. But thank you for pointing me in that direction. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Eric. Colleagues, we have opened a platform for question and answer. Those with questions, you can raise your hand or you can drop your question in the chat box. I'll be taking 3 questions per round, then Eric will give a response. I can see there are people who are raising hands. Let me see. Victor, you can direct your question to Dr. Makombe.
All right. Thank you so much, Jolene. And thank you so much, Eric, for an interesting paper. I have real interest in the field that you are discussing today. First, as a trade unionist myself, and secondly, as an area that I'm also researching on as well. I do take the point that you really raise, is that the decline in the presence and significance of trade unionism or labor movement in Zimbabwe. My first concern, I think, has already been addressed by Dr. Masakure when he addressed the question of characterizing the labor movement as a mewing kitten in the post-2000. And I was going to suggest that you broaden the labor movement, because as it is now clear that you're focusing on the thisCTU. My suggestion would have been, if you look at the broader labor movement that encompasses the ZFTU and the Zimbabwe Labor Center, you realize, in particular with the ZFTU, in the post-2000, it actually became a darling to workers because of the instant nature that it resolved labor disputes. It took the jump-and-jump approach that was similar to what was happening in the land reform system. So for workers, the approach that the newly formed ZFTU was taking became popular for them because it brought instant results for them. So if you look between 2003 up to around 2006, the ZFTU registered close to 113,000 members. And most of these were attracted by the nature of the resolution, labor dispute resolution that ZFTU approached as compared to what thisCTU was doing. So certainly from that perspective, that extent, characterizing such achievements as mewing kitten would be, at least from my view, be problematic. So that's one element I had. The second element, I think, has 3 issues, but that are all related. is to look at the significance of the amendment of the Labor Relations Act, particularly the removal of the clause of one union per industry. This was amended to allow a multiplicity of trade unions in a particular industry, and that gave room for the formation of splinter unions and the effect that had in undercutting the so-called traditional unions that existed. But secondly, is the nature of employer. You gave the example of the Chinese investors and so forth. But one aspect that you can add there is the interest by state officials or politicians in the economy. So, for example, take judges. Almost all judges in Zimbabwe are farmers. They are employers. I know quite a number of state officials who run transport businesses. So they have taken this, so the bureaucracy of labor dispute resolution system is now attracts the interest of people who are supposed to be adjudicators or referees in resolving labor disputes. And in particular case is the 2015 Zua case. The interest of the Supreme Court, all the bench of the Supreme Court are farmers. Some of the reasoning and the decision that led to the massive retrenchment at the time was in particular, I would argue, informed by the interest to deal with retrenchments of workers at the farms. So that then impacts on the desirability of workers, those that are willing to rely on trade unions in resolving labor matters. Related to that then is the criminalization of industrial job action. This is one of the biggest weapons at the disposal of workers, in addition to collective bargaining agreement. But since 1992, the government of Zimbabwe has criminalized job industrial action. It is actually a criminal offense to go on strike. And so without utilizing that weapon, workers no longer find it attractive to seek representation from trade unions. Otherwise, the trade unions are always engaged in this bureaucratic labor dispute resolution. You have to go through arbitration, labor court, high court, Supreme Court, and it may take 7 years before a matter is resolved. And for workers, they don't see it as beneficial. So I think those dynamics have then had serious great impact in terms of attracting the few workers that exist to continue membership with the trade unions. And we have quite a lot of other issues I think we can discuss outside the platform. But otherwise, thank you so much for
Thank you.
talk.
Thank you so much, Victor, for quite insightful dynamics that you have raised. Maybe we can take a question from Nathaniel and Tinashe. Or what would you prefer, Eric? Do you want to, because Victor has raised a lot of issues, do you want to deal with Victor's issues first, or I can take a question from Nathaniel and Tinashe?
I think I would benefit more from the questions. I think they are very insightful pointers, pointing me to certain directions that I need to consider. So I think I would benefit more from the questions. See how I can incorporate them.
Oh, okay, that's fine. So Nathaniel, then after Nathaniel, Tinashe, you can direct your questions to Dr. Eric. Then afterwards, he is going to respond. Nathaniel? I can see you're raising a hand.
Yeah, sorry. I like the paper, and okay. I have 3 minor questions. The first one concerns worker radicalization. You say the mass meetings of 1,000 workers in arrest at Africa's Union Square radicalized workers. My question is, will workers radicalized by these meetings, or the meetings were an expression of radicalization? What's the situation there? And then the second question concerns the 1997 strike, which you say was the largest and the most successful. But in the same paragraph, you also say the state raised taxes and so on. How do you measure the success of a strike? Is it by the numbers or the achievements of the strike? Because in the long term, it seems the workers lost out. And then the last question concerns what you call labor bureaucracy. What is this? Is it the same as the labor aristocracy? I thank you.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Tinashe, can you ask you a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. My first question may be a little unfair, but it has to do with how we historicize labor. First of all, if we are to historicize it colonially, the turning of people into workers has been historically viewed as problematic. And yet in the post-colonial period, we celebrate the labor movement. Now, I suppose this is partially because of the nature of the colonial project and how it had to be changed after independence to challenge it, right? And at the point at which land reform, with all of its problems, is coming up, should we then condemn the weakening of the labor movement in contrast to the giving away of land to Africans themselves? What is the better evil here? I hope this, I'm just playing a bit of a devil's advocate here. I just want you to reconcile what I'm talking about, because the labor movement is weakened, at least according to you, with the farm invasions. So that's the first question. The second question has to do with whether it is the right thing to talk about the reignition of a strong labor movement in a country with less than 10% of people employed. In what ways have people found ways of empowering themselves outside of being workers? And in that context, should our focus just be on the labor movement, or should we also focus on the alternative ways in which they've sought to empower themselves? And if so, what does that mean? Should we then go back to being labor focused, or should we also celebrate the innovations and initiatives that people have come up with in order to survive, and how best can we harness that in a very reconstructed economy, which industries until recently had all but collapsed? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tinashe, and the other colleagues who have raised contributions and different dynamics. I think it can be so overwhelming if we keep on asking questions. I can see Victor and Nathaniel, you are raising your hands again. I think for the meantime, Eric, do you want to respond or to clarify on on some of the issues that were raised by some of the colleagues there?
Yeah, but I'll see what I can pick and choose. I think the other questions are really calling upon me to think deeper and more critically around the issues that I raised. And I thank colleagues for those, very perceptive and insightful comments. All right, Gwande, I came across somebody who was known as Noah Gwande. I'm not sure if you are related. He's involved in the ZFTU. Maybe that would why justify some of your comments that it was a darling of workers and so forth. But maybe that's just a small issue. So I will look into the issues that you raised around the ZFTU. Yes, it was able to guarantee some instant results for some of the workers that joined, but obviously targeted the private sector just as much as the farm occupations were targeting private farmers. as such, there was not much headway made for the civil service. That's why you find that many public sector workers shunned, the ZFTU. But nonetheless, I'll see how I can reconcile the issues that you raised. And again, the amendment to the Labor Relations Act is very significant because it does away with the one sector, one union, tradition that had always been in place. I think I mentioned in my response that, for example, in the tourism sector, you have the emergence of what are known as yellow unions, and some of these numbers are actually embroidered. They're not really genuine figures because they are briefcase type unions that I think in the tourism sector it was known as HAPUS, hospitality, and I'm forgetting the actual for the acronym of this yellow union that emerges to challenge the established union. So the membership, is sometimes exaggerated, but again, it is to undercut the traditional unions. So there's an agenda to the ZFTU and to these splinter unions. Whilst it does offer a multiplicity of voices and strategies on how to engage capital in the state, I think at the same time we must be cognizant of the fact that they were also undercutting and undermining, the workers' grievances that they were tabling before by creating these multiple voices. I think the third point that you raised about the nature of employers, the interest of politicians, farmers, and so forth is something that I will definitely see how I can incorporate. And the fourth point, the criminalization of collective job action, those are very fine points. Thank you so much for that. Worker radicalization, and is it the meetings that radicalize them, or the meetings are themselves an expression of radicalization? Maybe the answer is in a bit of both, Nathaniel. I think the issues there that they went into these meetings with a narrow grievance list, but when they came out, they had a broader range of grievances. So there's strength in numbers. So again, it's something that we can maybe try and develop more as we're moving forward. But thank you so much for that point. Okay, yeah, I think I take the point on the 1997 strike. I think there were concessions that were made initially. I was kind of rushing over. There were concessions that were made in response to this strike, but the government, in order to fund it, then introduces these new tax measures. So, so it was maybe giving with one hand and taking with the other. But I think it's something, it is not as if the tax measures were immediately following the conclusion of the strike. It was actually now trying to finance those concessions that had been made. And there were other, taxes that were removed or reduced in response to the demands by the striking workers at this time. What is a labor bureaucracy? It's simply a unionists that are employed full-time as unionists, so they are divorced from the rank and file. Whilst they are representing the rank and file, they are not, in touch with the shop floor dynamics, so to speak. I think this is the case when you hear that some representatives, leaders in PTUZ, ZIMTA, in astonishingly high wages, and yet the people they are representing earn less than $100. So there's that disconnect between unionists that have become, career unionists, and they are no longer in touch with the rank and files. Hence, this kind of designation that they are now a labor bureaucracy, as opposed to, actual worker representatives. Tinashe, I think you mentioned the issue of how I historicize the turning of people into workers. I didn't want to go way back into the history, but I think according to the thesis that Phimister and Philosoph raise, they do point out that there was, from 1960, there was a depoliticization of the workforce, which accelerated with the turn of independence, and accelerated again in the 1990s with the adoption of these neoliberal measures. So indeed, the economy has, for a long time, I think it's 50 years or so or more, has not been able to create as many jobs as people that it is incorporating. And we need to celebrate some of the strategies that these people have adopted as alternatives in the informal sector and other avenues that they have adopted in response to these realities. But at the same time, those who remain in employment, you still have a public service sector. So we need, at the same time, it has to be in terms of how it is relating to capital and labor. This is kind of where I'm coming in. Are they able to gain those concessions, or they're simply being ignored? So my point of entry was simply to account for the incongruence in terms of the levels of exploitation and abuse that we see in the post-2000 period, vis-a-vis the almost absent, lack of engagement with labor. So it's being thrown aside, for various reasons that we, you have been highlighting, and the comments that are coming in from others. So thank you so much for those comments. Julian.
Thank you, Eric. Kudakwashe has a question. Kudakwashe.
Sorry about that. I had actually put my hand down because I noticed that the question that I wanted to ask had been asked in a much more clearer way by Victor. But just out of interest, is the reduction of the power of the thisCTU, the movement from it being the lion to your mewing cat, has it got anything to do with the reduction in numbers in terms of subscriptions by formally employed workers? Economy gets progressively worse. So much so that the thisCTU no longer has enough. I'm not sure, this is speculative, no longer has enough funding for its activities to be as robust as it used to be before, when it managed to harness enough of this subscription from workers. Thank you very much.
Eric, can you respond to that? We want to round off our presentation for today. I think we are way more than 1 hour. Some people might have other commitments, but I think a lot of colleagues have raised a lot of questions that can be so helpful towards your project. So yes, can you respond to Kuda? Then we conclude.
Yes, you are exactly right, Kuda Washe. The quantitative reduction in the labor force, for example, in 1998, thisCTU had a membership of between 400 and 500,000. But a few years later, it is now under 100,000. So obviously that undercuts the subscription base. But I think what I also raise in the paper is that there is a qualitative dimension as well that we need to consider here, in that of those that are remaining in informal employment, many of them are actually casual workers, younger workers, who are generally averse to joining in the activities of trade unions. So the number could be around 86,000, but in essence, those who are actively participating are far fewer than what is on paper. And also there's a role that the RBZ, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, sorry about that, played in actually cutting off funding from its international donors. So it suffered from various developments. Yeah, and maybe this will be, I assume this will be the last question. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you so much for the thought-provoking questions. Hand over to Joylene.
Dr. Kufa, you are on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you so much, colleagues, for being part of this conversation. Colleagues, we have raised a lot of insightful questions and the nuances. I think they are going to be helpful as Eric is going to develop his paper. This conversation can still continue even after this Microsoft Teams platform. I've dropped Eric's email address in the chat box. Those who have further engagements, you can get in touch with him there. We are going to have another seminar on the 14th of October. It's going to be an interesting paper. It's about the cannabis in Lesotho. Hopefully you're going to join us. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the night. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.